as I became an academic and started to do my graduate work in sociology, the one thing that became very clear to me is that I do not wish to study this subject. Because the closer I got to the subject, the more vast and engulfing it became. About 1994-95, I had the occasion to, as many of you here, see the film Schindler's List. And I remembered another list, and another list maker who had a very different fate and a very different treatment at the hand of history. And I guess I was now at the age where I had accomplished some of my academic goals and was prepared to enter a subject that I had feared for a long time. But of course, I'm not a historian. I knew very little about the subject. In fact, I recall in the early 90s, simply because of my work on intermarriage, I was approached by Moment magazine. They were doing a collection of statements by Jewish scholars on who their Jewish heroes were. And I submitted 2 entries. One was Rudolf Kasztner, and the other Hannah Senesh. Little did I realize, and as I look back now, how preposterous that juxtaposition was. It's a testimonial, frankly, to how little I understood of the subject that we're discussing today. That these 2 characters represented such vastly different perspectives and experiences. But it led me to a realization that I simply cannot ignore this subject anymore. And little by little, I began to get an education. And about 3 years later, I had the good fortune of meeting my friend and colleague, Shlomo Aronson, when he was here on a visiting tour of duty in New York and in Washington. And I continued what I regard as my postdoctoral tutorial in this subject. So I'd like to revisit some of the key points of the essential saga. And I think it's appropriate as we commemorate D-Day to reflect on both the triumph, but also the uncertainty of triumph. Because it's very easy to recognize triumph retrospectively. And historians are marvelous at stringing together the facts and the documents for future generations of scholars to make it seem as if it is all so intelligible. It makes sense, it fits together. But history doesn't happen that way. And the people who have to act don't know what's going to happen later, which is the reason why the title for this afternoon was chosen, An Uncertain Redemption. Some of the accusations against Kasztner and Brand and some of the other members of the Vada come after the fact, when it was known what finally happened. As if they knew what was going to happen. Much was not known, not then and not even later. And so some of what we're trying to accomplish here today is to remove the veil of emotion and the veil of political idealism on one side or another, and to explore, how did this rescue effort come about? Did the rescuers know what they're doing? Did they know what mistakes they are avoiding or making? How conscious were they of the choices? And to what extent were their choices made as if they were wearing blinders because they simply did not know? The essential facts we know: that the rescue effort by Rezer Kasztner and the other members of the Vada was the single largest successful rescue of any Jewish group during the Holocaust. It is the single largest rescue accomplished by Jews during the Holocaust. This we know. We also know that the accusations leveled against Kasztner and the ultimate price that he paid was leveled against no one else, and the price certainly was paid by no one else. And so there's a huge question mark that hangs over this entire story. Why? Why the price that he had to pay for what seems, even in the least generous interpretation of history, is an extraordinary act of heroism in rescuing so many of his brethren against incredible odds? How unusual, how extraordinary was this operation?
The issue which I wanted to study in Germany itself in the 60s was about the fact that, in my view, could be ascertained about the realities in Hungary at the time. And one of the questions was whether the Germans were ready to deal at all, to which extent rescue was possible, and mistakes were made on the road to bring about rescue, to which extent the Allies were ready to listen to the ideas of the Zionists, of the Jewish leadership in Hungary and outside of Hungary. And I've reached the conclusion, Egon, that the Jews at that time were trapped from all sides. That is to say, there was a notion that the Germans were ready to negotiate since Stalingrad, since 1943. And this is why the Jews of Slovakia, about 1/3 of them, were saved for a while, for a year or so, 18 months in fact, when the Holocaust in Slovakia has been stopped, allegedly as a result of bribing the SS people in Slovakia by the initiative of the local Jewish leadership, which was comprised of Rabbi Weissmandl, whose name was mentioned here, a Haredi anti-Zionist figure, and also by the Zionist leadership in Slovakia, headed by a heroine by the name of Gizi Fleischmann. And she should have a statue in every place where Jews live today. But the fact of the matter was that the Germans never intended to stop the Holocaust in Slovakia. The truth was that the Slovaks themselves stopped the Holocaust there. Not the Germans were the ones who brought about the secession of the Holocaust in Slovakia. But this brings us to what I call, Egon, the rescue dilemmas. That is to say, people would like to think that rescue was possible. And the second thing is that people seek for someone to blame for rescue negligence, and would like to interpret history in terms that fit their emotions. And in a way, they seek to blame their own people. And Kasztner was one of the victims of this syndrome. So now when we are talking about rescue dilemma, the issue is, and was, to do something or not to do anything. Kasztner's heroism is understood to me in terms of trying to do something in spite of all odds, in a situation in which all the, as we have heard, all the trump cards were at the hands of the Germans. And as I shall show to you later on, the Allies were extremely suspicious of any rescue effort and perceived in it a Nazi ploy and something much more serious than that. Jewish-Nazi common interest against the Allied war goals. Jewish-Nazi common interest to get Jews out of Europe, especially to Palestine, but not just to Palestine, to this country, which was closed, to anywhere else. So in this sense, the Jews were trapped from all sides. But Kasztner still was trying to do something, and he did succeed, having no trump cards whatsoever, but still being active. And for him, Zionism meant being active. Rescue dilemmas here should be understood in terms of doing nothing or trying to do something. And as I shall try to portray to you later on in response to Egon's question, I shall show you how he did succeed in rescuing many, if not everyone.
So did Kasztner believe in rescue?
Well,
Given everything that, and that's a very important question, because there's a big difference between the fact of rescue and believing when you're getting into it that you're going to rescue people.
What I was trying to say is that, first of all, he acted. Whether he believed or not is a different story, but what he was trying to do is to believe in the option of rescue by being active. What he did succeed in doing, trying to understand what was the strategic situation, what are the differences among the SS counterparts that he were dealing with. His strategy was to try and drive a wedge between Eichmann, who was the emissary of death, and people around Eichmann, and in this he succeeded. What he didn't know, and we didn't know until very recently, because the records have been opened in this regard only recently, the driving force behind the deportation of the Jews of Hungary to the death chambers was the German army, the Wehrmacht. And this is new, we didn't know that. They wanted the Jews out of what they called Operationsgebiet, the area next to the front when the Russians were coming. And they were the ones who tried to get the Jews of Budapest, at the end, out of Budapest to be killed. The German army, the Wehrmacht. And therefore, Eichmann had no competence whatsoever to save Jewish lives, except by negotiations, which were possible, at least with regard to a small minority, the train. Because Hitler allowed a small number of Jews, Hitler ordered Himmler and the others at the end of 1942, all this is new also, that a small number of Jews, rich Jews, could be saved for large quantities of foreign currency. Now imagine what the Allies were thinking about it. And this will give you an idea of the trap situation that I'm talking about. For the Allies, this was running against, contrary to all the laws of economic warfare. It meant collaboration with the enemy to save Jewish lives. And in this context, what Kasztner was doing is trying to make the Allies do things in spite of themselves. And the train story was a success after all. And the Allies were moved bit by bit, the War Refugee Board and so on, to do things that they didn't want to. But we have to know, if we commemorate D-Day, Mr. Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, War Refugee Board, which was established in January 1944 to save Jewish lives, didn't do anything until the success of the breakthrough from the bridgehead in Normandy in August. Only then the president was ready to allow them to do symbolic things, nothing serious, because he was afraid of what I call a Jews' war, of Americans being killed for us. And his job was to maintain what he perceived to be a national consensus. What for this war is being fought? And if you look at your screen today, TV screens, you'll see that this war, World War II, is fought for most Americans for their own liberty, not for us. Under these circumstances, Kasztner had to operate. And this must be understood to appreciate what he has done.
So the negotiation itself was the rescue. Is that what we're to take away? That,
Yeah,
that the object of negotiation was negotiation?
No, the object of negotiation was, to begin with, Kasztner didn't know that there was a permit given by Hitler to save Jews for money, few Jews for money. But he tried to negotiate. As a result of his initiative, the train could roll because Hitler allowed it. Mm. Now, since the war has deteriorated for the Germans, and the negotiations went on and on and on, Kasztner was able to drive a wedge between Eichmann, the angel of death, and this Kurt Andreas Becher, who was a much more pragmatic SS officer. And as a result of it, a wedge was driven among the members of Eichmann's death squad. At the end, this brought about, for example, not just to the, let's say, the saving of the 18,000 who were sent to Vienna, but all the concentration camps in Germany were placed by Himmler under the command of this Becher. And the remnants of the Jews living in those concentration camps, kept in those concentration camps, that were marched there during the last months of the war, those Jews were saved through the cooperation between Kasztner and Becher. On top of it, when such a wedge has been driven between Eichmann and his people, many Jews, Hungarian Jews, who were exiled, who were sent to Vienna. Vienna was a very important center of Hungarian Jewish life at the end of the war. And many Jews who lived in Vienna at that time, if it went according to Hitler's wishes, would have been destroyed. Eichmann's people in Vienna, one Krumai who was mentioned here, one Wislicheny who was mentioned here, kept the Jews alive in Vienna and in Theresienstadt concentration camp. Of course, they did it in order to have alibis for themselves. But the name of the game at that time was to negotiate with them and to keep them under pressure and to use Becher and to try and especially save the Jews of Budapest. So who saved the Jews of Budapest? Among others, Raoul Wallenberg, the Swiss Consul General Lutz, but also Becher placed SS guards, Waffen-SS guards, around Jewish areas in Budapest city. So it is not just the train, Egon. Mm. Now, the whole tragedy which brought about this verdict by Judge Halevi, that Kasztner has sold his soul to the devil because of that train, 1,684 people, who happened, so said his enemies, his own family, which is not true. Only several members of his family were on the train. Others were sent to Auschwitz. The list of the train passengers was not compiled by Kasztner personally, but by the whole committee, chaired by a very renowned Hungarian Jewish personality by the name of Otto Komoly. The anti-Zionist rabbi of Satmar, who arrived here and started to fight Israel and Zionism ever since he was saved on that train. All of them were on that train, and there was a list compiled by the whole committee, not just by Kasztner. But my point is that the train itself, which was a big achievement at that stage, was later on developed to a much larger rescue effort, which has to do with Budapest city and with the arrival of the Red Army, true. But on the other hand, if you negotiate, you win time, you win Becher, you allow the Russians to arrive, this is rescue.
So,
and then later on, the negotiations on the concentration camps in Germany itself. This was turned against Kasztner in a political context in which the train alone was described as if he neglected the whole Hungarian Jewry, being the leader of the Hungarian Jews, which he was not. The whole tragedy of the man, and he trapped himself in a way, but in an extremely tragic fashion, in order to be able to talk to the Nazis. He made himself a big leader. Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken him seriously. So Rudolf Rezsó Kasztner found himself living in Hungary, a foreign country, as a Zionist functionary, working for Keren HaYesod, trying to raise money with the high-handed Hungarian Jewish nobility, and we have heard something about them here. And they sent him to the servant entrance to collect the money for Keren HaYesod. And this was his career as the leader of Hungarian Jewry. What he did with others was to create a rescue committee, their own initiative, on the ground, to save Jews who ran away from Poland, from occupied Poland, to Hungary. So it was a local rescue effort by Hungarian Zionists in Budapest before the Nazis occupied Hungary, in a community in which the Zionists had no influence whatsoever. They were the smallest minority. And at the same time, the other extreme of the Hungarian Jewry was utterly ultra-Orthodox. The most extreme ultra-Orthodox community existed in Hungary next to the most extreme assimilated one. So the Hungarian Jewry was not made up of one section. Kasztner was not the leader of this, let's say, a very much divided community. Most of their traditional leaders couldn't care less about him. They were not very happy with his rescue activities before the occupation, because in their view, he jeopardized their position in Hungary. And suddenly he became the leader of the Hungarian Jews, who failed to warn them. Failed to warn them to do what? To rise against the Germans? They could have learned from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was known to everyone, or should have been known to everyone. Talking about the tragedy that I'm describing as a trap, multi-dimensional trap situation, the Ghetto Warsaw Uprising, according to Albert Speer in his interview with me, was one of the reasons why the Germans worked so swiftly in Hungary to avoid another uprising. That is to say, once the Jews tried to do something in Warsaw and save Jewish honor in another country, this was the base for the Nazi counter to the Nazi precautions to prevent another Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So they would have used every trick, every way, every method to get the Jews out of the country to Auschwitz as soon as possible. And this is what they did. At the same time, they sent Joel Brandt to this mission to Palestine, to the Zionists, to exchange million Jews for 10,000 trucks. When Brandt came to Palestine, first of all, the British arrested him, interrogated him, and they then let him go. And he went back to Palestine, Joel Brandt, and told the Zionist leadership, the Holocaust in Hungary is conducted in such a speed and has started because you failed to let me go back to Hungary. You are to be blamed for the Holocaust in Hungary, according to Mr. Brandt, because I am the key to rescue. And if you don't get from the Allies what the Germans want, or at least let me go with some kind of a promise, you are to be blamed for what the Germans are doing to the Jews in Hungary. Now here we get to the root of the matter in a way. That people who were involved in this put the onus of the blame with regard to the Holocaust on President Roosevelt, on David Ben-Gurion, on Reza Kasztner. But the whole point is that the onus of the blame was not resting, of course, on them. It was resting, as we've heard, on the Germans, on Eichmann and the others, who were decided to kill the Jews. And this is so terribly important. When we talk about rescue dilemmas, when we are blaming ourselves, we should understand that the roots of these accusations go back to some of the main actors of that time. It is not just political. Brandt was seriously talking about him being the key to the cessation or the continuation of the Holocaust without any right to do so. He also was talking about Allied trucks, and when you come to think of it, the idea was that of that Nazi, of that Gestapo agent who planted it in his mind. But come to think of it, how come he thought that the Allies will give the Germans 10,000 trucks? And how come the Zionist or the American Jewish leadership could have pushed the Allies to give the Nazis strategic goods? How come? And as I explained it, these people pushed the responsibility from their own shoulders in a very understandable way, from themselves, they were on the spot, to the shoulders of others. That is to say, to the shoulders of the Allies, to the shoulders of the Zionists. Who are we to blame them? They couldn't do anything there. So what they did, intentionally, I'm not sure, but psychologically very understandable. They made the others, the Zionists, the Allies, responsible for any further action that may or may not bring about some kind of a hope.